On a freezing February morning in
Need to be ready for what's
1945,
coming.
Corporal Daniel
This isn't
Matthews
just
stood
about
in the
us
mess hall of
anymore.
Camp Atterbury, Indiana, watching something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The steam rising from breakfast trays caught the pale winter light filtering through frosted windows, creating ghosts in the air between him and the man sitting 3 feet away. That man wore the uniform of the Imperial Japanese Army. That man might have been on the beach at Pearl Harbor when Matthews' cousin Thomas died. That man represented everything Matthews had been taught to hate for 3 years of brutal war. And in 30 seconds, Matthews was going to sit down and share a meal with him. The 23-year-old farm boy from Springfield, Illinois, felt his hands shaking as he gripped the metal tray. The bacon was still sizzling, slightly the eggs were steaming. The toast was warm enough that the butter had melted into golden pools on its surface. It was more food than most American families back home saw in a week of rationing, and he was about to give it to the enemy. Everything in Matthew's body screamed at him to walk away, to throw the tray, to do anything except what his orders demanded. His cousin Thomas had been a machinist's mate on the USS Arizona, 20 years old, 3 weeks from coming home on leave to marry his high school sweetheart. Thomas had burned to death in the harbor at Pearl Harbor while Japanese planes screamed overhead. Matthews had been at the funeral where they buried an empty casket because there was no body to bury. And now he was supposed to sit down and eat breakfast with a Japanese officer as if they were neighbors meeting at a Sunday church social. The contradiction was tearing him apart from the inside. But orders were orders, and the orders said that prisoners of war would be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. The orders said that American soldiers would maintain their principles even when the enemy had abandoned theirs. The orders said that this is what separated America from the forces of tyranny and barbarism. The orders said a lot of things that sounded noble and righteous when Colonel Anderson explained them in briefings, but felt like poison in Matthew's throat when he actually had to live them. He took 3 steps forward. The Japanese officer looked up. Their eyes met. And in that moment, Matthews saw something he had not expected to see. He saw fear, not defiance, not hatred, not the fanatical devotion to emperor and empire that the propaganda posters promised. Just pure, simple human fear. The kind of fear Matthews had seen in the eyes of deer on his family's farm in the moment before his father's rifle shot rang out. Matthews sat down. He placed his tray on the long wooden table. The Japanese officer stared at it as if Matthews had placed a live grenade between them. Then the officer looked at Matthews' face, searching for the trap, the cruelty, the punishment that must be coming. Because in the world this man came from, kindness from an enemy was impossible. Mercy was weakness. Compassion was a lie told by the corrupt and decadent to justify their failure to embrace the harsh necessities of total war. The translator. Private James Tanaka stood nearby, waiting to see if either man would speak. Tanaka was Japanese-American family locked away in an internment camp in California while he wore the uniform of the United States Army. His position in this room was a special kind of torture, hated by the prisoners as a traitor to his race, distrusted by some of the guards who saw his face and forgot his loyalty, a bridge between two worlds that both rejected him. Matthews picked up his fork. The Japanese officer watched every movement as if Matthews might suddenly transform it into a weapon. Matthews cut a piece of bacon. The crispy edge made a small crunching sound. He put it in his mouth and began to chew. The officer's eyes widened slightly, not because of what Matthews was doing, but because of what he was not doing. He was not mocking, not threatening, not performing dominance. He was simply eating breakfast. And then Matthews spoke. The words came out more gently than he intended, shaped by 3 years of his mother's voice reminding him that manners mattered even in hard times, especially in hard times. "Is the food acceptable?" Matthews asked. "Do you need anything else?" Tanaka translated into Japanese. The officer's face went through a series of expressions too quick to read individually, but adding up to something like shock. In the Imperial Japanese Army, guards did not ask prisoners if they needed anything. Guards gave orders. Prisoners obeyed or they suffered. The hierarchy was absolute. The distance between captor and captive was a chasm that could not be crossed. And yet here sat an American corporal asking a defeated enemy if he needed anything, as if he were a guest at a dinner party rather than a prisoner of war. The officer did not answer. He just stared at the tray in front of him. 4 strips of bacon, 3 scrambled eggs with butter melting into them, 2 slices of toast, a cup of coffee steaming in the cold air. It was identical to what Matthews was eating. Not smaller portions, not inferior quality, not the watery gruel and moldy rice that prisoners in Japanese camps received on good days and nothing on bad days. The same food, the same portions. As if the man holding the rifle and the man behind the barbed wire were somehow equal in the eyes of whatever force governed this strange new world. Second Lieutenant Takeshi Hayashi had been preparing to die since the moment of his capture 6 months earlier in the Philippines. 25 years old, artillery officer, son of a merchant family in Osaka. Everything in his training, his culture, his understanding of honor and duty told him that surrender was the ultimate shame, that a soldier who allowed himself to be captured had failed not just his comrades and his emperor, but the entire lineage of ancestors stretching back through centuries of Japanese history. That death was preferable to the dishonor of captivity, that a prisoner was less than nothing, a ghost, a non-person who had forfeited all claim to human dignity. And yet here he sat still breathing, still conscious, presented with more food than he had seen in half a year. The journey to this moment had been designed to kill him. 37 days in the cargo hold of a transport ship. 300 men packed into a space meant for 50. No windows, no ventilation beyond a few small grates that let in air thick with salt and diesel fumes. The heat during the day turned the hold into an oven. The cold at night seeped into bones and made sleep impossible. Men stood shoulder to shoulder because there was no room to sit. Sleep came in brief snatches, standing up, heads lolling forward onto the shoulder of whoever stood in front. The saltwater rations came twice a day, a ladle of water so saturated with salt that drinking it made thirst worse instead of better. A handful of rice, sometimes wormy, sometimes moldy, always insufficient. Dysentery spread through the packed bodies like wildfire. Men shit where they stood because there was nowhere else to go. The smell became a physical presence, a fourth dimension of suffering that made breathing an act of will. 3 men died during the crossing. Their bodies were left standing for hours because there was no room to lay them down. Eventually the guards came and dragged them up the metal stairs that clanged and echoed in the darkness. Canvas shrouds, a brief prayer, a splash. The Pacific Ocean took them without ceremony or marker. Their names would be recorded as killed in action because the alternative, died as prisoner, was too shameful for their families to bear. By the time the ship reached California, Hayashi had lost 45 pounds from a frame that had not carried extra weight to begin with. His ribs showed through skin that had taken on a yellowish gray color. His cheekbones were sharp enough to cut. His eyes had sunken into his skull. He looked like a photograph of famine, like a prophecy of death, barely delayed. The train ride across America should have been another ordeal, but instead became the first sign that something was different here. The prisoners traveled in regular passenger cars, not cargo containers. They sat on seats with cushions. They could see out windows at the passing landscape. Guards watched them, but did not beat them. When the train stopped at stations, local women from the Red Cross brought coffee and sandwiches. Real coffee. Real sandwiches with meat and cheese. The women smiled at the guards and ignored the prisoners, but the food was the same for both. Hayashi could not process this. In his experience, prisoners ate garbage if they ate at all. The idea that an enemy nation would feed its captives the same rations as its own soldiers violated everything he understood about war power and human nature. He kept waiting for the moment when the mask would drop, when the Americans would reveal their true intentions, when the cruelty and torture he had been promised by Japanese propaganda would finally materialize. But the moment never came. Instead came Camp Atterbury, 40,000 acres of Indiana farmland converted into a military installation, rows of wooden barracks painted olive green, guard towers with searchlights, barbed wire fences, all the infrastructure of imprisonment. But inside those fences, something unexpected was happening. Something that would force Hayashi to question every belief he had ever held about enemies, about honor, about what it meant to be a soldier and a man. The first night in the barracks, Hayashi met the other prisoners who would become his community for the next year. Hiroshi Kimura, 42, a school teacher from Tokyo before the war. Face deeply lined glasses held together with wire, voice soft but precise. Kimura had been captured at Guadalcanal, had survived 2 years of imprisonment, had watched the war from behind wire, and wondered what would be left of Japan when it ended. He appointed himself the informal leader of the barracks, settling disputes, maintaining order, helping the newer prisoners understand the strange rules of this strange place. Kenji Watanabe, 22 university student before being drafted, literature major, reader of Soseki and Kawabata, face still boyish despite the hardships of war, parents in Hiroshima. The last letter from home had arrived 8 months ago. His mother's careful handwriting describing the vegetable garden she was tending, the neighborhood association meetings, the hope that Kenji would return home soon to finish his degree. He read that letter every night before sleep, the paper thin and soft from constant folding and unfolding, the ink fading, but the words memorized anyway. The prisoners were sorted by rank, and camp leadership separated officers from enlisted men in different barracks, maintaining some echo of military hierarchy even in captivity. But the Americans did not enforce the rigid distance that Japanese military culture demanded. Officers and enlisted men ate in the same mess hall. They worked the same labor details. They played baseball in the same recreation yard. The boundaries that had defined their entire military existence were dissolving, and none of them knew what that meant. On that first morning, when Matthew sat down across from Hayashi and asked if the food was acceptable, Hayashi felt his worldview beginning to crack. Small fissures at first, hairline fractures in the foundation of everything he believed, but fractures that would widen over the coming months until the entire structure collapsed and he would have to build something new from the rubble. He picked up the chopsticks that someone had thoughtfully provided. In a small detail that spoke volumes about American organizational thoroughness, the mess hall kept chopsticks available for prisoners who had never used forks. Hayashi lifted one strip of bacon. The texture was wrong, crispy instead of soft, the edges curled, fat, glistening. He brought it to his mouth. The taste exploded across his tongue. Salt, smoke, fat, a hint of sweetness he could not identify, some mysterious American alchemy of curing and preparation. His body, starved for months, responded with a surge of hunger so intense it was almost painful. He had been taught that Americans were soft, corrupted by material excess, lacking the spiritual strength that came from deprivation and discipline. But if this was corruption, every cell in his body was betraying him by wanting more. He ate another strip. Then the egg's soft and buttery richness he had forgotten existed. The toast still warm, white bread, unlike the dark military rations he was accustomed to. The coffee bitter and strange, but hot, warming his hands through the ceramic mug. Matthews watched this without comment, not gloating, not mocking, just eating his own identical breakfast and occasionally glancing at Hayashi with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been something gentler. After several minutes of silence, Matthews spoke again. "My name is Daniel Matthews. I'm from Springfield, Illinois. That's a town about 100 miles south of here. Farm country. My family grows corn and soybeans." Tanaka translated. Hayashi looked up, startled. Why was this guard offering personal information? What was the tactical purpose? Was this some interrogation technique, building false rapport before the real questioning began? But Matthew's face showed no guile. He was simply introducing himself as one human being to another, following the social conventions of his culture, even though those conventions were designed for peacetime interactions between equals, not wartime encounters between victor and vanquished. Hayashi set down his chopsticks. Protocol demanded that he respond in kind. "My name is Takeshi Hayashi, 2nd Lieutenant, Imperial Japanese Army. I am from Osaka. My family operates a textile business." The words came out stiff, formal, shaped by military training that taught officers to reveal nothing beyond name, rank, and serial number. But Matthews just nodded as if this were a satisfactory answer to a reasonable question. "I hope your family is safe," Matthews said. And the kindness in his voice, the apparent sincerity of the sentiment, was almost more than Hayashi could bear. Because if Matthews meant it, if this was genuine human compassion extending across the chasm of war and culture and language, then everything Hayashi had been taught about American barbarism was a lie. And if that was a lie, what else might be false? What other lies had his government told him? How many of his beliefs rested on foundations of propaganda and manipulation? The breakfast continued in silence. Other prisoners and guards filled the mess hall. The room hummed with quiet conversation, the clink of utensils on metal trays, the shuffle of boots on concrete floors. Hayashi observed the scene with growing confusion. Guards sat among prisoners at seemingly random intervals. Some tables were all prisoners, some all guards, some mixed. There was no rigid segregation, no symbolic demonstration of dominance. It looked almost like a regular military mess hall, except that half the uniforms were American and half were Japanese. At one table near the wall, Sergeant Thomas Williams sat alone. He was older than Matthews, maybe mid-30s, with a weathered face that suggested hard years and harder choices. His jaw was clenched tight. His eyes tracked the room with barely contained fury. When his gaze fell on the tables where guards and prisoners sat together, his hands gripped his fork hard enough that his knuckles went white. Unlike Matthews, Williams radiated hostility. Unlike Matthews, Williams looked like a man who wanted blood. Hayashi noticed him because predators recognize predators. In Williams, Hayashi saw the pure hatred he had expected to find in all American guards. The desire for revenge. The need to inflict suffering equal to suffering received. This was familiar territory. This made sense. Williams looked like he wanted to kill every Japanese prisoner in the camp, and the only thing stopping him was the military discipline that held him in check like a chain around a wolf's neck. But Matthews was different. Matthews was an enigma. Matthews represented something Hayashi had no framework to understand, and that was more frightening than Williams' hatred, because Hayashi knew how to respond to an enemy who wanted to kill him. He had no idea how to respond to an enemy who asked if he needed anything and hoped his family was safe. The meal ended. Prisoners cleared their trays to a washing station. Guards filed out to their duty posts. The routine of imprisonment began. But for Hayashi, nothing would be routine again. That first breakfast had planted a seed of doubt that would grow over the coming months into a complete transformation of his understanding of honor, duty, strength, and what it meant to be human in the face of forces designed to strip humanity away. As Matthews walked past on his way out, he caught Hayashi's eye and gave a small nod. Not a bow, not a salute, just a simple acknowledgement of one person seeing another. And in that gesture, small as it was, Hayashi felt the foundations of his world begin to shift. The cracks were spreading, the collapse was coming, and he did not know whether to fear it or welcome it. The days at Camp Atterbury settled into rhythms that defied everything Hayashi understood about military imprisonment. Morning reveille at 600 hours, breakfast at 6:30, work details assigned at 7. The structure was familiar, the hierarchy recognizable, but the content of daily life kept delivering small shocks that accumulated into larger questions about the nature of power and the meaning of defeat. On his fourth morning, Hayashi was assigned to an agricultural work detail supervised by Sergeant Robert Crawford. Crawford was a man built from Georgia red clay and generations of farming wisdom. 29 years old, but carrying himself with the patient authority of someone twice that age. His hands were large and scarred from years of handling tools and animals. His voice was slow and deliberate, each word measured out like seed corn, never wasted, always purposeful. The work detail assembled outside the barracks at 7:15. 15 prisoners, 2 guards, a truck loaded with fence posts and wire and tools. The February air bit exposed skin. Hayashi's thin prison uniform provided almost no protection against the Indiana cold. He had grown up in Osaka, where winter meant cool rain, not this knife-edge wind that turned breath to fatigue and made fingers ache. Crawford looked over the assembled prisoners with the practiced eye of a man evaluating livestock before auction. Not cruel, not contemptuous, just practical assessment of what these bodies could accomplish in the hours ahead. "We're repairing fence line on the South 40, Crawford said, and Tanaka translated into Japanese. "Posts rotted through over winter, need replacing before spring, ground's half frozen so it'll be hard work. But you do it right, you do it once, you do it wrong, you do it again. Up to you." The truck rumbled across camp roads and out through a gate in the perimeter fence. For a moment, Hayashi felt a spike of adrenaline. They were leaving the prison compound. No walls, no barbed wire immediately visible. Just open farmland stretching toward a horizon of bare trees and gray sky. One guard drove the truck. Crawford sat in the passenger seat. Only Private Marcus Johnson, a nervous-looking 20-year-old from Ohio, actually carried his rifle at ready. The rest of the prisoners sat in the truck bed, unsecured, unbound, theoretically capable of jumping out and running, but running where they were in the middle of Indiana farmland in February. Japanese men in prison uniforms with no money, no English, no knowledge of American geography. Even if they somehow evaded immediate pursuit, they would freeze to death within a day or starve within a week. The prison was not the barbed wire. The prison was the entire continent, the ocean on both sides, the language they could not speak, the faces that marked them as enemy in every town from here to either coast. The fence repair work was exactly what Crawford promised. Hard, physical, mind-numbing in its repetition. Dig out the rotted post. Fight frozen ground that resisted the shovel. Set new post. Pack dirt and gravel around it. String wire. Move to next post. Repeat. Hayashi's hands, soft from months of inactivity, blistered within the first hour. By the second hour, the blisters had burst and his palms were raw meat. He said nothing. Worked through the pain. In the Imperial Japanese Army, showing weakness invited punishment. Better to suffer in silence than to risk additional hardship. But Crawford noticed anyway. The old farmer missed nothing. He walked up to Hayashi at the mid-morning water break and held out a pair of leather work gloves. "Should have given you these at the start," Crawford said, through Tanaka's translation. "No sense tearing your hands apart. Can't work with ruined hands." Hayashi stared at the gloves. In Japanese military culture, this would never happen. Guards did not provide comfort to prisoners. Suffering was part of the punishment. Pain was educational. But Crawford was offering gloves with the same casual practicality he might show a hired farmhand. Not mercy, not kindness. Just practical recognition that damaged tools were less useful than maintained tools. Hayashi took the gloves. They were worn soft from years of use, the leather shaped to hands larger than his, but still offering protection. He murmured thanks in Japanese. Crawford nodded and moved on to check the other prisoners' work. No dramatic moment, no philosophical revelation. Just a small gesture that planted another seed of doubt about the nature of American cruelty. The work continued through morning and into afternoon. At noon, the truck returned with lunch. Not the watery soup Hayashi expected, not starvation rations. Sandwiches, thick slices of bread with ham and cheese and mustard, an apple for each man, cookies, chocolate chips still warm from the camp kitchen, coffee in thermoses that kept it hot despite the cold air. The prisoners ate in silence, still waiting for the catch, the punishment, the moment when American generosity would be revealed as elaborate torture. But no punishment came. Crawford ate the same lunch. Johnson ate the same lunch. They all sat on the truck bed, feet dangling, chewing sandwiches and drinking coffee and watching clouds scud across the gray sky. Almost peaceful, almost ordinary, almost like a regular work crew taking a regular lunch break, except that half the men wore American uniforms and half wore Japanese prisoner markings. As the days turned to weeks, the work details became routine. Fence repair gave way to field preparation as February grudgingly surrendered to March. The frozen ground began to thaw. The bare trees started showing hints of green. Prisoners tilled soil, planted early crops, maintained equipment in buildings. The agricultural work was hard but not brutal, exhausting but not designed to kill. They worked 8-hour days, not the 16-hour death marches of Japanese labor camps. They received adequate food, not starvation rations. They were paid. The payment was what finally broke Hayashi's ability to maintain his understanding of how the world worked. At the end of his first week on the work detail, Crawford lined up the prisoners and handed each man 80 cents in camp scrip. Small bills printed specifically for prisoner of war camps. Not legal tender outside the fence, but functional currency within it. Hayashi held the paper in his blistered hands and felt his mind struggling to process the implications. Prisoners do not get paid. Prisoners are property. You do not pay property for existing. You do not compensate slaves for their labor. The entire logic of the prisoner of war system in Japanese military culture rested on the premise that captives had forfeited all rights, including the right to economic agency. They worked because guards ordered them to work. They received the minimum food and shelter necessary to keep them alive long enough to extract useful labor. The concept of paying them wages violated the fundamental power dynamic that separated captor from captive. And yet here Crawford stood, handing out money as casually as he had handed out work gloves, his face showing no sign that he was participating in anything unusual or revolutionary. 80 cents a day, Crawford said, through Tanaka. Army regulation, prisoner labor gets compensated. You work, you get paid. That's how America works. That's how America works. The phrase echoed in Hayashi's head long after the work detail returned to camp, long after he had been processed through the gate and sent back to his barracks. That's how America works. As if the laws of economics and human dignity function the same way in war as in peace. As if being defeated in battle did not strip away personhood. As if the category of prisoner still included the subcategory of worker entitled to wages. Kimura sat on his bunk that evening studying his own 80 cents with the careful attention of a scholar examining an ancient text. "This is unprecedented," he said quietly. Several other prisoners had gathered around, drawn by the shared confusion. "In 2 years of captivity, I have never heard of prisoners being paid for labor. Fed, yes, barely. Sheltered minimally. But paid actual currency they can spend on discretionary items. This violates every principle of military imprisonment I have ever encountered." Watanabe turned his script over and over, the paper crinkling softly. "What can we even buy with this?" The answer came the next day when the canteen opened for prisoner access. The canteen was a small building near the center of camp, previously restricted to guards only. But twice a week on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, prisoners were allowed entry in small supervised groups. Hayashi entered with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, still waiting for the trap to spring. The interior looked like a civilian store shrunk to fit inside a military building. Shelves lined the walls. A counter with a register sat at the back. A guard supervised but did not interfere. And the shelves held an impossible array of consumer goods. Cigarettes in colorful packages, Lucky Strike and Camel and Chesterfield. Candy bars Hershey's and Baby Ruth and Milky Way. Toiletries soap and toothpaste and razor blades. Writing materials, paper and pencils and envelopes and stamps. Coca-Cola in green glass bottles, 5 cents each, stored in a cooler that kept them cold. Hayashi walked the aisles, slowly reaching out occasionally to touch items with his damaged hands. Each product represented a tiny piece of American civilian life, now available to Japanese prisoners of war for the price of a few days' labor. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These were the luxuries of the enemy nation, the material excess that Japanese propaganda had told him made Americans weak and decadent. And now he could participate in that excess. He could become complicit in the corruption. All he had to do was hand over the money he had earned by working. He chose carefully: a Hershey's chocolate bar, a bottle of Coca-Cola, a bar of soap that smelled clean instead of the harsh lye soap issued by the military, a writing tablet and pencil. Total cost 40 cents, half his weekly wages. He approached the counter where a bored-looking corporal rang up the purchases without comment or contempt, just mechanical efficiency, then placed the items in a small paper bag and handed them over with a nod. Hayashi carried his purchases back to the barracks like sacred objects. He sat on his bunk and carefully unwrapped the chocolate bar. The smell hit him first sweet and rich and foreign. He broke off a square and placed it on his tongue. The chocolate melted slowly, coating his mouth with sweetness, so intense it was almost painful. He had not tasted sugar like this in years. His body responded with an involuntary shudder of pleasure, chemicals releasing in his brain, reward systems activating that had been dormant through months of deprivation. The Coca-Cola came next. He pried off the cap using the opener attached to the cooler, an action he had watched other prisoners perform with varying degrees of success. The first sip shocked him. Carbonation, a sensation he had never experienced. The bubbles burst on his tongue, the liquid cold and sweet and slightly acidic. He coughed, surprised, then took another sip more carefully. The taste was unlike anything in his culinary experience. Not tea, not sake, not water or juice, or any beverage he could categorize. This was purely American, a flavor profile invented by a nation with the wealth and creativity to transform sugar and carbonation and mysterious flavoring into a commercial product that people apparently purchase for pleasure. Watanabe watched from the neighboring bunk with wide eyes. "What does it taste like?" Hayashi struggled to find words. "Like sweetness and bubbles and strangeness, like America in liquid form." The chocolate and the Coca-Cola were not just commodities. They were symbols. They represented an economic system that recognized even defeated enemies as participants in markets, as consumers with agency and choice. Every transaction in that canteen was an implicit acknowledgement of personhood. You cannot sell to an object. You can only sell to a person who possesses the capacity to choose to evaluate, to exchange value for value. The days accumulated into weeks. The March cold gave way to April warmth. The Indiana landscape transformed from dead brown to living green. Grass grew, trees budded, wildflowers appeared in patches of color against the drab military palette. And the prisoners adapted to rhythms that felt less like imprisonment and more like some strange hybrid existence between captivity and normalcy. Sunday afternoons became recreation time. The camp had a large open area designated for prisoner-use basketball hoops, at one end open space for other activities. On the third Sunday in April, Tanaka organized a baseball game. Guards versus prisoners. The announcement generated confusion among the Japanese prisoners. Many had heard of baseball, knew it was popular in both Japan and America, but few had ever actually played. The rules seemed Byzantine, the equipment mysterious, the purpose unclear. Tanaka spent an hour explaining. 9 innings. 3 outs per half inning. Runs scored by touching all 4 bases in order. Strikes and balls, and the complex geometry of fair and foul territory. The prisoners listened with the polite attention of students in a classroom, nodding periodically, understanding perhaps 40% of the explanation. Matthews and Crawford helped set up the field, dragging bases into position, laying out bats and gloves borrowed from the camp recreation supplies. The game began badly. Hayashi, assigned to bat first because of his officer status, approached the plate with no clear idea what he was supposed to do. Matthews stood on the pitcher's mound, tossing the ball gently from hand to hand, calling out encouragement. "Just try to hit it, Lieutenant. Don't overthink it." The first pitch came in slow and straight. Hayashi swung the bat in a motion that resembled a samurai sword strike more than a baseball swing. He missed by a foot. The ball smacked into the catcher's mitt with a solid thwack. Hayashi felt his face heat with embarrassment. In Japanese military culture, public failure was shameful. Officers especially were expected to demonstrate competence in all activities. But here he stood, unable to hit a ball, thrown by an enemy guard who was actively trying to help him succeed. The second pitch, another sword strike swing, another miss. Matthews called from the mound, "Level swing, Lieutenant, like you're sweeping something off a table." The third pitch. Hayashi adjusted his mechanics, tried to swing level, made contact. The ball dribbled weakly toward the pitcher's mound. Matthews fielded it cleanly and pointed toward first base. "Run that way, first base." Hayashi ran, but he ran toward third base, having no internalized understanding of which direction first base actually was. The entire field erupted in laughter. Not mocking laughter, not cruel laughter, just genuine amusement at an honest mistake. Crawford, playing third base, was laughing so hard he had to lean on his knees. Johnson, playing right field, actually fell down. Even Williams, watching from outside the fence line, had something that might have been almost a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth before he caught himself and forced his face back into its customary scowl. Hayashi stopped running, realized his error, felt his face burning hotter. But then he did something that surprised himself. He laughed, not a polite social laugh. A genuine laugh at his own absurdity, at the ridiculousness of the situation, at the sheer improbability of a Japanese artillery officer playing American baseball in an Indiana prisoner of war camp, while guards and captives laughed together at a shared moment of comedy. Tanaka ran out to redirect Hayashi to first base. "That way, Lieutenant," counterclockwise around the bases. The game continued for 2 hours. The final score was 12-8, guards winning, but the score almost did not matter. What mattered was the gradual erosion of distance between victor and vanquished. Hard to maintain pure hatred toward a man you had just watched run the wrong direction and laugh at himself. Hard to see someone as subhuman when you were coaching them on proper batting stance. The baseball game accomplished in 2 hours what 100 lectures on Geneva Convention protocols could not. It created shared experience, shared laughter, shared memory that transcended the categories of captor and captive. But not everyone laughed. Williams watched from his position outside the fence, jaw-clenched hands gripping the chain link hard enough to make his knuckles white. He saw Matthews coaching Japanese prisoners on base running. He saw Crawford giving advice on fielding ground balls. He saw American guards treating enemy soldiers like teammates in a casual Sunday game. And everything inside Williams screamed that this was wrong, that this was betrayal, that his brother Michael had not died in the Philippines so that Williams could watch Japanese prisoners play baseball and laugh. That night in the guard barracks, the tension finally erupted. Matthews was cleaning his rifle, the routine maintenance that kept weapons functional, when Williams slammed into the room like a thunderstorm given human form. "What the hell was that, Matthews?" Matthews looked up, still holding the cleaning rod. "What was what, Sergeant?" "That circus out there. That comedy show. You teaching Japs how to play baseball like you're running a summer camp for kids." Matthews set down the cleaning rod carefully. "We were following orders, Sergeant. Recreation time for prisoners is mandated by Geneva Convention protocols." Geneva Convention. Williams spat the words like poison. "You know what the Japs gave my brother? No Geneva Convention, no baseball games, no chocolate bars from the canteen. They gave him a death march in 100-degree heat. They gave him dysentery and starvation. And when he couldn't walk anymore, when he collapsed in the road, you know what they gave him? A bayonet in the gut. They left him there to die in the sun like a dog." The barracks had gone silent. Other guards pretended to be occupied with their own tasks, but every man was listening. Matthews stood slowly, meeting Williams' eyes. "I know what happened to Michael, Sergeant. Everyone here knows, and I am sorry, but our orders are clear. We treat prisoners according to international law." "International law?" Williams moved closer, voice dropping to a hiss that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "You think they care about international law? You think the men who killed Michael gave a damn about international law?" "No, I don't think they did, but we are not them. We are Americans, and Americans follow the law even when our enemies don't." "You sound like Colonel Anderson, spouting propaganda. Pretty words about principles and honor. But you didn't see what I saw. You didn't get that letter describing how Michael died. You didn't have to tell your mother that her youngest son was tortured to death by animals who don't deserve mercy." Matthews held his ground, though his hands were shaking slightly. "You're right, I didn't see what you saw. My cousin died at Pearl Harbor, but it was quick. He didn't suffer like Michael did. But suffering doesn't give us permission to abandon who we are." "Who we are?" Williams laughed without humor. "Who are we, Matthews? Are we the suckers who treat our enemies better than they treat us? Are we the fools who play games with men who would kill us if they had the chance? Are we the cowards who hide behind rules instead of taking the revenge we have every right to take? We are Americans who believe that even our enemies have certain rights that cannot be violated. That's what we're fighting for, Sergeant. That's what separates us from the forces we're fighting against." Williams stared at Matthews for a long moment, something dangerous moving behind his eyes. Then he turned and walked out the door, slamming hard enough to rattle the windows. In the silence that followed, no one spoke. No one met Matthews' eyes. The divide in the barracks had just become visible and undeniable. Matthews sat back down and picked up his cleaning rod with hands that shook slightly. He understood Williams' rage. Part of him shared it. Part of him wanted to walk into the prisoner barracks and beat every Japanese soldier until his hands broke. But another part of him, the part shaped by his mother's voice and his father's example, and the small-town values of the Springfield, Illinois, understood that rage was easy. Any animal could bite back when bitten. What took real strength, what required genuine courage, was maintaining principles when every instinct screamed to abandon them. The question was whether that strength would be enough, whether those principles would hold, and whether the fence that separated guards from prisoners was strong enough to contain the violence that Williams carried inside him like a bomb waiting for the right moment to detonate. The morning after this baseball game, Sergeant Thomas Williams stood at attention in Colonel Anderson's office while the Indiana sun struggled through dirty windows to illuminate the maps and orders and bureaucratic machinery that kept Camp Atterbury functioning. Anderson sat behind his desk, a man in his early 50s, whose face carried the weight of 3 wars and 30 years of service. He had not asked Williams to sit. This was not that kind of meeting. "Sergeant Williams, I received reports that you confronted Corporal Matthews last night regarding prisoner recreation activities." Williams kept his eyes fixed on the wall behind Anderson's head. "Yes, sir. I expressed concerns about fraternization between guards and prisoners." Fraternization. Anderson leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked. "Is that what we're calling it when American soldiers follow Geneva Convention protocols?" Sir, with respect, I question whether teaching enemy soldiers to play baseball constitutes necessary prisoner management. Anderson was quiet for a moment, studying Williams with eyes that had seen too many men break under pressures both visible and invisible. Sergeant, how long have you been in the Army? 12 years, sir. And in those 12 years, how many times have you disobeyed a direct order? Never, sir. How many times have you questioned command decisions in front of junior enlisted personnel? Williams' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Never, sir. Until last night. Anderson stood, walked to the window, looked out at the camp spreading across Indiana farmland. Your record is exemplary, Sergeant. Bronze Star, 3 combat deployments. Efficiency ratings that put you in the top 5% of non-commissioned officers in your grade. You are exactly the kind of soldier the Army needs. Williams said nothing, waiting for the other boot to drop. But personal tragedy does not give you permission to undermine unit discipline. Your brother's death does not grant you authority to ignore regulations. And your grief, however justified, does not excuse you from treating prisoners according to the laws of war. Sir, those prisoners are enemy combatants who would kill us if they had the opportunity. Those prisoners are defeated soldiers who surrendered and are now entitled to specific protections under international law. Law that America signed and agreed to follow. Law that we expected our enemies to follow when they hold our men. They don't follow that law, sir. They torture our prisoners. They starve them. They work them to death. I know. Anderson turned from the window and his face showed something that might have been pain, or might have been exhaustion, or might have been both. I know what they do to our men, Sergeant. I read the intelligence reports. I see the photographs. I hear the testimony from escaped prisoners. I know about the death marches and the slave labor and the systematic brutality. I know that Japanese prison camps have mortality rates of 25%, while our camps have mortality rates below 1%. I know all of it. Then, sir, with respect, how can you ask me to treat them with kindness when they treated Michael like an animal? Anderson moved back to his desk, but did not sit. I'm not asking you to feel kindness, Sergeant. I'm ordering you to follow regulations. There's a difference. You can hate every Japanese soldier in this camp. You can dream about revenge. You can carry rage in your heart until the day you die. But you will not act on that rage. You will not violate Geneva Convention protocols. And you will not undermine other guards who are doing their duty. And if I can't do that, sir, then you will request a transfer. There are a dozen postings I could send you to where you would never have to see a Japanese prisoner again. Germany, Italy, stateside training facilities. You are too valuable to lose, but I will lose you before I let you turn this camp into something that violates American principles. William stood silent for a long time, the kind of silence that stretches until it becomes its own form of communication. Finally, he spoke, voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Sir, I would like to remain at my current posting. Why? The question hung in the air. Anderson was not letting Williams off easy. He wanted an answer, a real answer, something that went deeper than military protocol and automatic responses. Because running away doesn't honor Michael's memory. Because hiding from hard things is cowardice. Because if I transfer out, that means they win. That means the men who killed my brother succeeded in turning me into something less than what I should be. Anderson studied Williams' face for any sign of deception or manipulation. Found none. Just raw honesty and pain. All right, Sergeant, you can stay, but understand this clearly. You will treat prisoners according to regulations. You will address any concerns through proper chain of command. And if I receive another report of you confronting subordinates about following orders, I will remove you from this camp so fast your head will spin. Are we clear? Crystal clear, sir. Dismissed. Williams saluted, executed a perfect about-face, and walked out of the office with his spine straight and his hands steady. But inside, nothing was settled. Nothing was resolved. The rage still burned, the grief still consumed, the need for revenge still clawed at his insides like a living thing. Anderson had given him permission to stay, but staying meant confronting every day the men who represented his brother's killers. It meant watching Matthews treat enemies like friends. It meant enduring the slow torture of mercy when every fiber of his being demanded blood. He could do it. He had the discipline 12 years of service had taught him how to bury feelings so deep they became invisible to everyone except himself. But burying was not eliminating. The rage would remain festering in darkness, waiting for the moment when discipline finally failed and the beast inside him broke its chains. Meanwhile, the routines of imprisonment continued with relentless normalcy. The work details, the meals, the recreation periods, the slow accumulation of small interactions that gradually eroded the absolute categories of enemy and ally, replacing them with something more complicated and harder to define. Hayashi found himself settling into patterns he had never anticipated. Morning work detail with Crawford, learning American agricultural techniques that were simultaneously more mechanized and more thoughtful than Japanese methods. Afternoons in the camp library, a small building stocked with English language books and magazines donated by civilian organizations. Evenings in the barracks talking with Kimura and Watanabe and the other prisoners about everything except the war, as if by mutual unspoken agreement, they had decided that dwelling on combat and death and defeat served no purpose. The library became Hayashi's sanctuary. The books were mostly pulp novels and old magazines, nothing intellectually demanding, but they represented access to American culture in ways that lectures and propaganda could never provide. He paged through Life magazine, studying photographs of American cities and farms and families. He attempted to read westerns about cowboys and Indians, understanding perhaps one word in five, but absorbing the rhythms of English prose. He found a book about Abraham Lincoln and spent hours with a dictionary that Tanaka had loaned him, slowly translating sentences about a president who had preserved a nation through civil war and freed enslaved people and been assassinated for his troubles. The Lincoln book troubled him deeply. Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as fundamentally weak, unable to make hard sacrifices, corrupted by material comfort and individualism. But Lincoln's story suggested something different. It suggested a nation capable of tearing itself apart over moral questions, willing to fight its own people, to end slavery, producing leaders who could inspire millions and pay with their lives for their principles. This was not weakness. This was a different kind of strength, one that Hayashi had no framework to process. One afternoon in late April, Matthews found Hayashi in the library, struggling through the Lincoln biography. The corporal approached slowly, as if not wanting to startle him, and gestured at the book. "That's a good one. Lincoln, Honest Abe, greatest president we ever had," most people would say. Hayashi looked up, surprised that Matthews would initiate conversation. Through the broken English he had been slowly acquiring and supplemented by hand gestures, he managed to communicate. "He free slaves, then killed." "Yeah." Matthews sat down at the table, uninvited but not unwelcome. "John Wilkes Booth shot him at a theater, 5 days after the Civil War ended. Lincoln saved the country and freed 4 million enslaved people, and his reward was a bullet in the head." Hayashi frowned, processing. Why killed if war over?" "Because some people couldn't accept what he did. Couldn't accept that slavery was ending, that the South had lost, that America was going to be different than what they wanted. So they killed him. Revenge maybe, or hate, or fear of change." The parallel was not lost on Hayashi. Revenge, hate, fear of change. He thought about William's face, the barely contained fury, the sense of violence, held in check only by military discipline. He thought about his own rage when first captured, the desire to die rather than live with the shame of surrender. Revenge was universal. Hate transcended culture. Fear of change afflicted Japanese and Americans equally. In Japan, Hayashi said slowly, fighting for words, "We taught emperor is divine. Cannot be wrong. Surrender is impossible. But now emperor surrender. So everything we taught is lie." Matthews nodded slowly. "Must be hard, having everything you believe turn out to be propaganda." "In America, you taught what is American belief," Matthews thought for a long moment, trying to distill something complicated into words that could cross the language barrier. "We believe that all men are created equal, that everyone has certain rights that can't be taken away. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. We don't always live up to those beliefs, but they're what we aim for. Even enemy, even prisoner has rights. Yes, even enemy, even prisoner. That's why we follow Geneva Convention. That's why we feed you the same food we eat. That's why we pay you for your work. Because the rights don't disappear just because you're defeated. They're inherent. part of being human. Hayashi stared at the Lincoln book at the photograph of the tall man with the sad eyes and the stoic face. This is why you different from Japanese military. You believe human has value even when human is weak. Something like that. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of philosophical concepts pressing down on a moment that should have been simple. A guard and a prisoner talking about books in a library. But nothing was simple anymore. Every interaction carried freight, raised questions, challenged assumptions that had seemed unquestionable just months before. As April turned to May, the camp took on different characteristics. The weather warmed. The prisoners were allowed to cultivate small gardens near their barracks, growing vegetables that reminded them of home. Japanese eggplant and daikon radish from seeds that somehow survived the long journey from Japan to America, carried in pockets and sewn into uniform linings by men who had not known whether they would live to plant them. The gardens became focal points of pride and competition, prisoners tending their plots with obsessive care, comparing growth rates and discussing cultivation techniques. Crawford observed this gardening passion with professional interest. One afternoon, he brought seeds from his own collection, Georgia heirlooms passed down through 4 generations of farming. Here, he said, through Tanaka's translation, offering packets to Hayashi and Kimura. Tomatoes, best variety I've ever grown. Try planting them next to your eggplant. They'll support each other. The gesture was small but significant. Crawford was sharing something personal, something tied to his own family history with enemy prisoners. The seeds were not military issue. They were private property carried from Georgia to Indiana, precious, because they represented continuity and tradition in the patient work of grandfathers and great-grandfathers, selecting the best plants year after year. To give them to Japanese prisoners was to implicitly acknowledge that those prisoners would have futures, would have gardens of their own, someday would participate in the same ancient cycle of planting and harvest that connected Crawford to his ancestors. Hayashi accepted the seeds with a formal bow that he could not suppress, despite being told repeatedly that such gestures were unnecessary. Thank you, Sergeant. I will grow with care. See that you do. Those seeds have been in my family since before the Civil War. Be ashamed to waste them. The gardens grew. Eggplant and tomatoes side by side, Japanese and American plants sharing soil and sunlight. The symbolism was heavy-handed enough that Kimura commented on it one evening sitting cross-legged in his garden plot pulling weeds with careful precision. I wonder if Crawford realizes what he's done, given us a visual metaphor for reconciliation. Japanese vegetables and Georgia tomatoes growing together. Maybe he knows exactly what he's done, Watanabe said. He was working on his own plot, which contained mostly flowers rather than vegetables. Colorful blooms that served no practical purpose but made the barracks area less dreary. Americans are not stupid. They are different from us, but not stupid. Different how, Hayashi asked. Watanabe considered, hands deep in the soil. We Japanese value collective harmony, individual sacrifice for group benefit, obedience to hierarchy. Americans value individual freedom, personal initiative, questioning authority. Both systems have strengths. Both have weaknesses. Neither is inherently superior. Japanese system led us to disaster, Kimura said quietly. Blind obedience to emperor and military leadership led us into unwinnable war. Led us to commit atrocities. Led us to this. He gestured around the camp. Prisoners in a foreign land, our nation destroyed. But American system has contradictions too, Hayashi pointed out. Matthews told me about slavery, about civil war, about how Lincoln was killed for freeing enslaved people. They preach equality, but practice inequality. All nations have contradictions, Kimura said. The question is whether the nation can acknowledge its contradictions and try to improve, or whether it denies them and pretends perfection. The conversation was interrupted by the dinner bell. The prisoners cleaned their hands at the water pump and filed into the mess hall. The evening meal was meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread. Adequate nutrition. Nothing fancy but consistent. Hayashi had gained back 20 of the 45 pounds he lost during the transport ship journey. His ribs no longer showed. His face had filled out. He looked less like a corpse and more like a human being. Williams entered the mess hall carrying his tray. For 6 months now, since the confrontation with Anderson, he had maintained rigid protocol. He followed every regulation. He treated prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards. He never raised his voice, never showed overt hostility, never violated any written rule. But he also never ate with the prisoners. Every meal, Williams carried his tray to a table as far from Japanese uniforms as possible. He ate alone quickly, eyes down, then left as soon as he finished, following the letter of the law while violating its spirit. Hayashi watched Williams, sometimes trying to understand the sergeant's internal landscape. The hatred was obvious. The desire for revenge radiated from Williams like heat from a forge. But Williams never acted on it, never allowed it to translate into prohibited behavior. The discipline was impressive, the self-control remarkable. Hayashi wondered what it cost Williams to maintain that control day after day, meal after meal, confrontation after avoided confrontation. After dinner, the prisoners gathered in the recreation yard. The baseball equipment had become popular games organized spontaneously without guard supervision. Hayashi was improving, had learned to run the bases in the correct direction, could occasionally make solid contact with the ball. The mechanics were still foreign, the strategy obscure, but the physical pleasure of hitting a ball, squarely feeling the vibration through the bat, watching it arc into the outfield, that was universally comprehensible. Tonight the game was prisoners, only guards watching from the sidelines. Matthews stood near the fence, smoking a cigarette, talking quietly with Crawford. Johnson sat in the guard tower, theoretically on watch, but mostly just observing the baseball game below. The evening was warm, the air soft, the light golden, as the sun moved toward the horizon. Almost peaceful, almost normal. Williams appeared at the fence line, drawn by sounds of activity, despite his determination to maintain distance. He stood 20 feet from Matthews and Crawford, hands gripping the chain link, watching Japanese prisoners play American baseball, with equipment provided by American military, laughing and shouting and arguing about calls in broken English. His face was stone, but his knuckles were white where they gripped the metal. Crawford noticed Williams watching, called out, "Evening, Sergeant." Williams nodded acknowledgement but said nothing. "They're getting pretty good," Crawford continued. "Watanabe can actually hit curveballs now. Kimura's got a decent arm for pitching. Give them another month, might actually be competitive against a guard team." Williams turned and walked away without responding. Matthews watched him go, face troubled. "He's going to break eventually." "Maybe," Crawford said. "Or maybe he'll hold it together until rotation sends him somewhere else. Man can only carry that much hate for so long before something gives. That's what worries me, when something gives." The baseball game continued until dark forced them to stop. The prisoners returned to their barracks, still energized, still talking about plays and mistakes and who hit the best and who made the best catch. Hayashi lay on his bunk, listening to his fellow prisoners argue about baseball strategy in Japanese, peppered with English terms they had learned. Strike, ball, home run, out, safe. The languages mixing naturally, barriers eroding one word at a time. He thought about Williams standing at the fence, rigid with controlled fury. He thought about Matthews' obvious concern. He thought about Crawford's prediction that hate could not be carried indefinitely without consequence. And he wondered what would happen when Williams finally reached his breaking point, when discipline finally failed, when the rage he had been containing for 6 months finally found release. The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, because history was accelerating toward a moment that would change everything, a moment that would force every man in Camp Atterbury to confront questions they had been avoiding. A moment that would arrive on the morning of August 6, 1945, carried by a single bomber flying over a city that most American soldiers had never heard of. But for now, in the warm Indiana evening, the prisoners slept and the guards maintained their watch, and the routines of imprisonment continued with the illusion of permanence. As if this strange peace could last, as if the war would never end, as if the atomic age was not about to begin with a flash of light bright enough to be seen from space, and a mushroom cloud that would haunt humanity's dreams for generations. If you served during this time, if you remember when news of advanced weapons began to change how wars were fought, we want to hear from you. How did your generation process the knowledge that warfare had entered a new era? What did it feel like to realize that the rules had changed forever? Share your memories in the comments, because what happened next at Camp Atterbury would force guards and prisoners alike to confront the unthinkable.